May you live in interesting times. It's not a toast, but a curse according to old lore, and 2020 certainly has been interesting times. Now more than ever, we must look to our fourth estate, journalism, to give us a fact-checked version of the truth. Joining us today is Ken Dixon, a storied reporter who last year entered the Connecticut Journalism Hall of Fame, to talk about the state of journalism in Connecticut and the stories that have been on our minds this year. We'd like to thank our new premier sponsor at Digital Back Office Palo Alto Networks. Check them out at digitalbackoffice.com or paloaltonetworks.com. As well as our sponsors at Gateway and Housatonic Community Colleges. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or member municipal leaders. Ken, thanks for being here today.
What does storied mean, Matt? Storied.
Storied. It means that you've had a long and varied career in news media in Connecticut, which is saying something.
Well, I've been employed, yeah. That's saying something.
As we said in the intro, you've recently been inducted to the Connecticut Journalism Hall of Fame after 40 years as a reporter. So that counts as storied. What has it been like to cover Connecticut for that long?
Every day is a different story. And so our development is arrested at around age 25, Matt,
As a reporter?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's no different. I don't feel any different than I did 40 years ago, except like online stuff. It's more work. Mm-hmm. There's a race to get it online. But I really love the fact that a story can evolve during the course of the day. You can. Mm-hmm. I just posted something about the governor's extension of the moratorium on evictions till the end of August. And, I probably have maybe 300 words up now, and I'll probably have, 5 times that by the time it goes to heads toward the printed paper later tonight.
So it's evolving right now online as you're reporting on it. And then and when that kind of gets a little bit farther along, that's the version that they'll then grab and put in the print version.
Yeah, and there are 8 dailies, so they're different deadlines for each, but essentially, yeah, the story will be changing over the course of time, and that's a good luxury to have.
Yeah. So it's 8 dailies within Hearst in Connecticut.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And when you started out, who were you writing for?
I was writing for the dear old Bridgeport Telegram, the morning newspaper, the feisty morning newspaper in Bridgeport that got deep sixed around 1991, maybe, when Thompson owned us before they bought Reuters. And we shared the newsroom with the then Bridgeport Post.
So now in this digital age, you're covering, you said 5 dailies. Like, is that all of Connecticut essentially at this point?
Let's see, Danbury, Middletown, Torrington, New Haven, Bridgeport, Norwalk, Greenwich, Stamford, and is that 8? I think I got them all.
So pretty much the entire western half of Connecticut at this point.
Yeah, there's nothing on the eastern side of the Connecticut River.
Speaking of the important stories of the day, in over 30 years of being the Capitol reporter, essentially, for her.
25, only 25.
Only 25. Okay, well, you're a newbie, but we'll let it slide. In those 25 years, what are some of the big stories that stand out to you that you remember breaking and that you felt good and important work was done by journalism on those?
Roland certainly was big. Dan Malloy beating Tom Foley twice. They were big. Got to and Ned Lamont beating Stefanowski. I got into the Foley's background and Stefanowski's background. I'd like to think that I gave voters enough information to make an important decision. Yeah, a lot of it is the General Assembly is day to day.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily the big flashy stories, but they're important in aggregate. They're probably more important than some of the bigger headline stories.
Well, if you live with the legislature every year, remember the legislature, Matt?
I do. I was there once when it was open. Yeah.
Yeah, March 11th. There's an arc to the legislative sessions, and you know so much crazy stuff during the course of the session that the time compresses toward the end, and you'll know enough background to ask important questions, to know when there's a rat, say, in the budget, a rat being a special interest that you've become aware of thanks to sources of yours or whomever, or just the fact that you remembered, hey, what happened to, whatever.
And remembering whatever happened to and source and stuff, I think that's one of the important things to remember, that, the AP or some of the bigger news can't necessarily do, that a local reporter like yourself will have that kind of knowledge base of what someone was up to last year, what they were up to 10 years ago, and some of these reoccurring faces in Connecticut politics. But yeah, how has like the legislature been closing and that sort of stuff? How has that affected your job? Just like, how are you following? Has it changed how you're getting information?
Well, a lot of what the governor's been doing, like today at 4 o'clock, he's going to be doing a news conference from the state capitol, and the reporters are going to be remote. But there's a list, and it's you actually get a better shot at questions because you're called on in particular. You don't have to try to shout over your.
So it's not the jockeying for position from the crowd, governor. There's a list of questions going on the side, sort of thing.
Yeah, we don't do it that way. It's mostly whoever can talk over everybody else out in the field. But like the name of the game, if you want to get an exclusive, you kind of like the governor does his thing. Let's say he was at a farm to families event, a food event in Torrington. And, he did his little news conference, and, if you want a special question for a story you're working on, you just wait for him to finish, for the TV people to walk away, and then you hit up the governor. I did that with him on Friday in Bridgeport at a COVID event.
What about the governor? Kind of, he still has to be very visible and all that kind of stuff. What about like legislators and some of the other Capitol players there? Are you finding access to them hard at this time, or?
No, either I can call them directly, or their press people will have them call me. They're very accessible, usually very accessible.
So it's not holding up your ability too much to gather information?
No, but actually it's my car is doing really well now because I haven't put on 600 miles a week since March on it. Well, we're lucky we've got the technology because, who knows? I've been meaning to read the book about the 1918 flu, John Barry's book on the flu. I did a Zoom with him through the National Press Foundation. He was super interesting. I should have read the book by now, but I have not, and shame on me. But who knows what was going on in 1918 in the Connecticut General Assembly? I mean,
for some of the issues we've had with people coming on to council meetings and saying stuff they shouldn't, or hackers and that kind of stuff, it's still probably a heck of a lot easier now to be able to try to social distance and still make government function than it would have been in 1918. Like that seems like we don't want to forget, as much as there are some frustrations and possible issues with us, how much the technology is helping us, I think, in this case.
Yeah, I just covered literally like an hour ago, I covered a meeting of the Housing Committee of the General Assembly, talking about the governor's extension of the moratorium on evictions. And they had the housing commissioner there. Everybody got a say. It wasn't the smoothest thing in the world. If I were in the Capitol, I would have been able to follow the commissioner out of the room and ask her some follow-up stuff. Because sometimes they're, you know, it's a citizen legislature. They're smart, but sometimes they don't have the background that some of the reporters have, or the training to ask particular questions, and you kind of sit there and, well,
yeah.
Okay.
You mentioned the governor and some of his things he's been doing since the pandemic started. And currently, Connecticut has one of the lowest transmission rates in the country. We've been trending down in general, while a lot of the country has been trending up. Do you give the governor credit for his handling of this situation? And what do you see as the successes of the administration's handling so far?
On the face of it, I'd say more people could have died, but on the downside, sorry, there's some thunder in the background here. On the downside, it took them a while to get a handle on how hotbeds the nursing homes are. And you know, that's.
And do you see that as a failure of the Lamont administration, or is that kind of governors and government in general in this country? Was, you know,
I'm not up on you know, much of the country besides New York and Connecticut and New England, but there was no expertise in this. You just had to hope for the best. Certainly, we've flattened the curve. I just heard as I was covering here, right, here's an example of the advantage of being online. In my left ear, I had Governor Cuomo's news conference, and on the computer, I was watching the housing committee. It looked like Cuomo is probably going to cut back on indoor dining by Wednesday because he doesn't like the way New Yorkers are handling that. So is that going to be Ned's next thing? Certainly that they've got this calculus of states that they want to quarantine if they come into Connecticut, and there are a bunch more that are meeting those specifics. I guess maybe Lamont might post something on Wednesday about that. Have I begged your question enough?
Well, just in general, like what do you think, have you seen them do that you think they did right? That was, you know, and or more generally, do you think it's the transmission rate in Connecticut going down, is that part of good governing? Yes.
The latter. It's definitely part of good governing. You can argue whether we have the most have done the best. Boy, excuse me. Have done the best recovery job. I think you could say, you know, yes at this point. We just have to see how people are responding, and people wearing masks in public seems to be the biggest thing, probably the masks in public. You know,
is that just the visibility of it as an issue, the way it's been politicized by some people on the national stage, or?
I think that's been proven medically that it helps stop the spread. I mean, you can't deny. Let's see, Sunday there were 103 people hospitalized, five new fatals on Sunday. 4 new fatals on Saturday. I mean, I'm not discounting it, people dying. 9 on Friday, but
hospitalizations. Compared to the national trends line, we're doing well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We're 103 hospitalizations today, and April 22nd we had 1,972 hospitalizations.
So we're doing something right, it seems like.
Yeah, and I think the governor surrounded himself with enough people who know what they're doing. Whatever happened,
he's willing to listen to experts and take advice.
Yeah, if anything, he's a collaborative type, and that's the best thing you can say to him. That's probably his his strength and his weakness. But you can't really criticize somebody who says that they're keeping an open mind. I mean, last week, he was under the criticism on Thursday for kind of talking broad outlines of reopening schools. And this 50-page report that was supposed to drop sometime today, although he said he was going to give it to Johanna Hayes on Friday. I don't think that happened.
Okay.
And he certainly didn't sign up for this, but
none of us did.
Right. It's like the prospects of a millionaire medical doctor running for governor is less likely than the heir to the 18th or 20th century banking fortune.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH LP 103.5 FM. So speaking of money and corona and everything, one issue that's near and dear to our members, the municipalities, is the handling of the CARES Act, which gave Connecticut over $1 billion in coronavirus relief funds. You recently reported that $75 million of that money was being freed up. What do you think the holdup was? Was it the federal government, or was it something else entirely? What was the story with all that?
I think Melissa McCaw, the governor's budget secretary, was literally, there was some kind of deadline she had to observe, and she was just totaling up reports from various towns and cities.
So it took time to do the work?
Yeah, I think to add up whatever in the 169 towns and cities. And I think one of the problems is, and you might know this better than I do, but the state's fiscal year goes from July 1st to June 30th, and a lot of these towns are not in sync like that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I know generally the towns are pretty on top of their budgeting because they have to be. They can't kind of kick it down the road like they can at the state level. But I also know that a lot of them are dealing with some pretty unprecedented expenses and situations right now. So it might have taken.
Yeah, and the state still has to come up the main claim to fame for the General Assembly is to come up with a balanced budget every year, and that they purchased these economic recovery notes under Jody Rell that I think they were still paying off forever. They would say, oh yeah, well, let's not pay off that final 300 million, that's the can kicking down the road.
So a recent story by Keith Phaneuf said that federal guidelines appear to suggest that hundreds of millions be dedicated to municipalities, approximately 630 million. While your article pins down that figure to advocates for towns and cities. Is there room for interpretation the way the guidelines are written? Do you think that municipalities should be seeing the $630 million?
I think it's the requirement is it's all COVID related. I think there's less wiggle room for the towns in that.
Yeah.
But I would defer to Keith, on that story. He's the budget maven. Certainly, a lot of this depends on a follow-up bill that can survive the U.S. Senate down in D.C.
Some of those funds are going to plug up holes in the state's budget. In covering the Capitol, would you say that the state is more primed to handle this than before? And what has led to that?
The taxpayers fortunately have this emergency fund called the Rainy Day Fund, emergency reserves that have pumped up to $2.5 billion, I think, probably by the end of tomorrow is the end of the fiscal year, June 30th.
Yeah.
And so I think the governor wants to take 600 million of that to balance this this budget, and then they're really in trouble because they're looking at a $2.5 billion shortfall in the upcoming fiscal year.
Yeah.
They're going to have to do some serious cutting, especially if they can't get the DC to cough up some
more money.
More billions. Yeah.
shortfall that you're projecting, was that there already, or has that been exacerbated by the
Oh yeah,
pandemic?
yes, exacerbated by the COVID.
Just a lot of money going out, and I guess they're expecting the taxes coming in, income, sales to all be down, I'm
Yeah,
assuming.
everything's way down.
Yeah.
Which is why, and maybe this is this goes back to the way the governor has managed this coronavirus stuff, because we never shut down the big defense plants or major construction projects. And a lot of people were able to continue working from home. The restaurant and bar industry, that's about 160,000 jobs there.
Yeah.
And some of that, like that extra $600 in federal unemployment relief, probably was helpful to a lot of people. But certainly his phasing, this is the time to be a governor where you cannot satisfy everybody.
Everybody's not going to be happy during a pandemic. There's just
no, it's like, some people were ready to open their barbershops, in May instead of June. And the restaurants wanted to give it a whirl earlier because, they were dying.
Yeah.
We'll have to see how many survive this. And the proof's in the pudding. It's like he's reopening, slowly. So, I mean, it still looks good, knock on wood for Connecticut getting, he likes to say, the governor likes to say that the economy is now 95% back, but, restaurants are just doing a fraction of their work.
Changing gears a little bit here. So we're in the middle of this epidemic right now, but the recent murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis has set off a whole chain of events that, among other things, led to the removal of the Columbus statue in Worcester Square right here in New Haven. Connecticut's, a fairly liberal state, but do you think it was ready for these changes?
You're probably never ready for a change, but some of those people who, from North Haven who came back down to Worcester Square to explore their Italian roots, were pretty much called out on that. It's like symbols. To me, it's like, well, I guess they're not going to put up a statue of Queen Isabella of Spain, who backed Columbus.
Who actually funded the whole thing.
Yeah, but certainly, the colonization of the quote New World, the diseases we brought, or they brought. My people, I think, were still like mucking around in Ireland eating potatoes until the early
after that.
1800s.
Yeah.
But it's the white people have to think about this. It's like if it's a symbol of oppression, stick it in the basement of the Knights of Columbus Museum. As my friend from the Mirror, Jacqueline Rob Thomas, reported, they're even marching in Weston, which has like a 1.7% Black population. Yeah, and exclusionary zoning just by the nature of the prices and the zoning requirements.
Yeah. What do you make of, related to this? It seems like the national media has focused largely on kind of the violent protests and that sort of stuff. Whereas the ones in Connecticut, like I know we had once in New Haven where they shut down 95 on the afternoon, like walking around, and it's largely been peaceful and well organized. Do you think there is a failing on some of the national media not to report on all these other ones in New Haven, Weston, all these other places where people are expressing it peacefully?
Well, that's the role of local newspapers to get that down into the community. I don't expect the New York Times to send somebody to Weston.
In an op-ed, you said that despite the coronavirus and the police misconduct that led to all these protests and stuff, you don't see it translating to any sort of permanent change. Can you expand on your reasoning there a little bit? For instance, do you see school regionalization and affordable housing as something that can create fundamental change? What's your take on all this?
Well, if they get rid of 8-30G that towns have been hiding behind as reasons to avoid low-income housing,
Hmm.
that's a start. But it's a rural and suburban dominated legislature, and these people who go to the House and Senate get selected by their town committees, the Republican and Democratic town committees, and they have to, bring home the bacon. They have to protect, the folks back home.
So you don't see big changes in a lot of stuff happening because from these protests in Connecticut.
Well, I think big stuff's already happening. There's a lot of awareness. There's, you look at the people involved. It's not just people of color, and something's happening, and they've got to get savvy enough to be in a position to get into the House of Representatives. And for that, if you want a third party, that's pretty hard. I mean, the election rules in Connecticut, petitioning rules make it very tough for people. Certainly, this would be a year for progressives to try to get on the ballot, because I expect as a blue state, there's going to be some kind of wave, another wave, a variation on the wave of 2018.
What do you think about what some of the cities and towns have done recently with declaring racism a public health problem?
Well, it is. If people are getting shot, I mean, 3 years ago we had this poor 15-year-old boy in a stolen car in Bridgeport, Jason Negron, who, for whatever reason, was driving backwards on the street and got shot by a cop, and they kept his body in the street for like hours. It's like that's upsetting. And I think when I was covering police, regularly 20, 30 years ago, I always said that the Bridgeport cops were social workers with guns. And I think, a year ago, they arrested one of our reporters videoing on the sidewalk. I'm wondering, A, training, and B, who are they hiring? Are they just hiring boys with guns? And that's a public health hazard. And
you think it's perhaps a smart angle to come at it from, is the public health angle?
Yeah, and certainly, if you listen to a police scanner, half the calls are domestic disputes. And, maybe you'd be better off, with a social worker on call, who's probably paid less, certainly isn't dressed like a SWAT team, showing up and trying to mediate something.
And does that tie into some of what people are talking about now with the defunding the police idea? Like spending less on police. When you mentioned, police as social workers,
right?
Is the idea maybe spend less on the police force and a little bit, or not, taking it all away, but less on the police and more on actual social workers to do things that maybe social workers should be the ones doing.
Yeah, and I think defunding the police is a battle cry that the Republicans, I'm sure, are going to grasp as they try to hold on in this fall. But it's like it's certainly a snappy 3 words, but because you don't want to say reallocate resources, although it is alliterative, so maybe Matt,
that might play better. Some people will frame it when they say defunding police, they're saying, oh, they mean just get rid of police altogether.
Right.
And which some people are, but in general, what people are talking about is spending less of the budget on the police force and more of it in social work, in outreach and community programs to maybe prevent or deal with situations better. Exactly. What do you see coming in the future for Connecticut politically in regards to the police, all these sort of things? What's on your radar for the next couple of years here, and what role does journalism play in that? It's a public service. I've always considered myself, a public servant without a decent pension. Now, pensions is a whole other show. We can't get into those today.
I have a penchant for it. Next couple of years, I'm interested in knowing whether the millionaire governor is going to want to do 4 more years of this after he hasn't taken a day off probably since.
So you're questioning
March.
whether he would want to do it, not whether he could win at this point.
Oh right, yeah, because. I mean, at this point, one of the things I've noticed is that the Republicans really don't have, they're just grasping for any kind of issue. And it's, maybe that's the upside of not having, of having like one bill passed this year. Certainly this upcoming legislative session in July, there's a lot of ambition, and when it comes down to it, a special session, if they can do absentee ballots and mandatory body cams, and maybe some resource allocations is kind of tough in a special session at the start of a budget year that you're looking at a major multi-billion-dollar deficit. That's going to be super interesting. I'm a daily newspaper reporter, so I don't look ahead 2 years. I look ahead like what's my column going to be on Sunday, and it's only Monday. I'm not going to start worrying about that till later in the week.
I know some of the stuff, before everything happened with the pandemic, some of the things we heard being kicked about issues, there was, legalizing cannabis, there was immunizations and that sort of stuff was an issue. I was up at the Capitol one day and there was stuff going on with that. Tolls were a big one. Do you see any of those coming up?
No.
They've kind of all been overshadowed.
Yeah, for this year, I mean, they're gonna need revenue next year, so I expect. The election. I don't see the tolls. Maybe sports betting and cannabis. Those are kind of no-brainer revenue things. Less controversial because they're basically sin taxes anyway.
So easy things like that could help with the money situation, and will probably get bumped up, and some other bigger social things might be put off for now.
I don't know. We had a story in today's paper about how Shelton is thinking about joining Derby in some kind of regional education thing, and Derby's already talking about Ansonia. You could save a few $100,000 by having only one school superintendent instead of 3. But there's a lot of cultural separation and tribal stuff in the valley. You don't want the Derby kids and Ansonia kids at the same high school, because then you'd only have one football team instead of
with 169 towns with very distinct histories in Connecticut. Do you see the situation we're in now kind of forcing their hand on some of these issues that have historically been pushed to the side?
On the face of it, you'd think this would be the time, but the governor, being of a particular class, doesn't want to raise income taxes on the state's wealthiest, which would be one way to drive some revenue. But he's called that a non-starter. Certainly, he's doing the Democrats a favor this year by allowing them to run for re-election without talking about increased taxes, without having to defend increased taxes. Push has to come to shove, and this crew in the General Assembly's got to prove it. They have to prove it.
And if they don't, you think there might be some changes made at the ballot box and shortly thereafter? Like, is this make or break for some people to kind of prove themselves in a real emergency situation?
Well, I mean, the urban lawmakers have been saying this for years, but they're outnumbered. It's the suburban and rural types, and unless unless the Weston lawmaker, can be convinced and then go back home and convince the Planning and Zoning Commission that we need, 100 affordable housing units, wherever, downtown, across from the high school, who knows?
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as that happens around the state, then I'll believe it.
Well, I guess to close out on a little bit of an upbeat note, is there any stories that you've come across since the pandemic hit give you hope, and some things that are working, some things that people are doing right?
Oh, there are so many medical heroes in this
Mm-hmm.
state. I've been lucky enough to just kind of sit around and most of the time cover the governor's news conference,
Mm-hmm.
like this. But I mean, you're like Saud Anwar, the state senator from South Windsor.
Mm-hmm.
He's been self quarantining at home because he's working, shifts at the Manchester hospital,
Mm-hmm.
swathed in PPE and shields and everything, trying to keep people alive. And that's that makes me feel proud of them. Yeah.
Yeah. That there's people rising to the occasion.
Yeah, and even the governor, who knew this was going to happen, and he surrounded himself with enough good people like Josh Cabal at Department of Administrative Services, Dr. Gifford at the Department of Public Health now.
Mm-hmm.
It's just been, and numbers crunchers, and he's trying to get the message out about social distancing, for just hammering that home.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like the one green state now, so that's
doing something right.
Yeah.
Well, Ken, thanks so much for talking with us today. Thanks for doing what you do. Keep reporting on everything that's going on and keeping everybody informed.
Oh, thanks a lot, Matt.
All right. Thanks to our premier sponsor, Digital Back Office Palo Alto Networks, which you can check out at digitalbackoffice.com and paloaltonetworks.com. Also thanks to Gateway Community College and Housatonic Community College. Learn more about them at gatewayct.edu and housatonic.edu. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer, Christopher Gilson is our producer, Harry Draws on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check us out on Facebook and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.